What's happening, New Hampshire? My name is Jon Kiper. I'm here at the studio in Manchester. Just want to talk to you a little bit about the state of cannabis in New Hampshire. I'm running for governor. Part of my platform is I want to legalize cannabis. Personally, I'd really like to see the proceeds going into housing to build more affordable housing. And as you probably know, cannabis has been an issue in New Hampshire for a long time. You know, all the states around us have legalized it, and we're the last ones in New England to not allow recreational cannabis sales. And, you know, it's frustrating. Many people don't understand why that is, and that includes me. And for many, many years, I was banging my head against the wall. I'm saying, why is New Hampshire not have legal cannabis? And when I started talking to some folks that were on the committees that were discussing this, I learned that one of the reasons was that the people who are making these decisions in the legislature, one complaint I heard was that they had been to Maine and they thought that the pot shops, you know, were tacky, which I thought was an interesting reason for us to not have legalized cannabis. Because one thing that comes from legalized cannabis is tax money, which we in New Hampshire are desperately in need of for housing and schools and roads and all these myriad of reasons. But yes, apparently one of the reasons that it's not legal is because it's tacky. Another complaint is the smell, you know, and I think that's kind of funny that people complain about the smell of marijuana because there's some smells I really hate. I hate the smell of diesel engines. I hate the smell of, you know, some restaurants have got a lot of fry oil, you know, coming out of them, and that can be very annoying too. But you don't see me advocating to ban Chinese restaurants. It's just kind of part of living in a city, you know. So one thing that's good to know, I'm running for governor. I would like to legalize cannabis. I've got a plan out there to do so. The other candidates, and you should know this if you care about this issue, the Republicans do not, both of them, want to legalize cannabis. Chuck Morris and Kelly do not want to legalize cannabis. So if you want to see legal cannabis in our lifetime, vote for a Democrat this coming election. Now, it's important to know that I've come out pro-cannabis. The other two candidates for the Democrat candidates have also indicated that they would like to see it legalized. And the real issue comes down to who is in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, because really they will decide what the bill looks like. You know, they work with the governor, but ultimately it really depends on who those folks are. And that's where the plan that I came up with was trying to appease both the Democrats and the Republicans and give them both a little bit of what they want. And we got a kind of funny situation with cannabis because right now the Republicans are favoring a state-run model similar to the way that we sell liquor. And they want the Liquor Commission to oversee it, I think, generally speaking. The Democrats want a privatized model. And why this is funny to me is because I was looking at the Liquor Commission when I first started running for governor, when I was first thinking about it. And the thing that's annoying about the Liquor Commission from a restaurant perspective is that they have a lot of laws and rules that they enforce, many of which make no sense. And, you know, isn't it annoying that we can't just go to the gas station and buy a bottle of booze or whatever? I mean, I've always thought that was just silly. You go to Maine, you can do it. Why can't we do that in New Hampshire? And the thing I realized was when I looked at the budget, the Liquor Commission brings in a ton of money for the state of New Hampshire, and that's why Republicans really like it. And why is the Liquor Commission even possible? Because it was created in 1933, right after Prohibition. So there was no liquor lobby to fight for a privatized model. So I say this because when I looked at it, I realized the Liquor Commission is basically socialism. It's state-owned monopoly, right? And the Republicans love it. So this cracks me up because the Republicans are always railing against the dangers of socialism. But yet, when it comes to the Liquor Commission, they absolutely love it because why? It keeps their taxes low. And that is really all that they want. And I totally understand that. I don't want to pay any more higher taxes than anybody else. But I recognize that we need taxes to fund roads and schools and clean water. So this is what cracks me up about it. So the Democrats want a privatized model, and I understand their logic, which is, you know, we live in a free market society, and also, you know, the state of New Hampshire has been locking people up for decades for the sale and the possession of cannabis. So does it make any sense for the state to then make the money off of cannabis? Like, that just seems morally wrong. But it just is kind of funny because these two roles are just sort of reversed in the logical way that you think they would be. Now, to talk more about this, because I am definitely not an expert, and while I've been following this from the peripheral, I've got a friend here, Daryl, who has been working in the cannabis lobbying industry for a long time, and he's going to tell us more about the state of cannabis in New Hampshire currently and the bill that's going through, and he's going to tell us all about it.
Well,
thank you, Daryl.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. So my name is Daryl Eames. I'm the founder of the NH Cannabis Association. We started this about 6 years ago when we had a bill come out of the House we thought might become law, and realized there was no support mechanism for the industry. Very quickly we realized the Senate had been killing everything, so we shifted more to helping people write legislation, testifying in front of Senate and House committees. But the most important part of what we do is we talk to residents and non-governmental organizations all throughout the state, hundreds of them over the last 6+ years. I'm also a consultant in the space, so I speak with operators all over the country, hundreds of them every year. So we've got a pretty good sense of kind of what works and what doesn't, and what the government's role should be in cannabis. Now, you brought up a good point, the Liquor Commission, which is something that we'll want to talk about, but let's just roll back to a couple of years ago. We had HB 639, which was more of a traditional free market bill. It passed the House with one of the largest, I believe, yes votes in history for a cannabis bill. It had wide senator support up until the moment it didn't. And I believe after it was killed, the day after or so, the governor came out and said, if we're going to legalize, here are some things that I'd like to see. Here are my concerns. After that, there was a commission formed late into the summer and fall, but their mandate was to explore only a franchise concept. Now, the franchise is a word that's being used, but it's really Liquor Commission control, state control, top-down control of the means of production, the socialist style, just as you had mentioned. Ironically, that commission failed to actually produce and vote for a bill, and rumor on the street was at some point there was going to be that concept coming potentially from the Senate. It would be passed in the Senate and come to the House, where the House has been very amenable to most things cannabis. And so we looked around and said, hey, maybe we need a more free market bill in order to have a talking point or something to promote, or at least a great bill to fight for versus the kind of state takeover model. And that franchise bill never arrived. And so the HB 1633 made its first stop into Commerce Committee in the House, and immediately there was a takeover attempt. A senator came in, put that franchise model bill on the table, and said, if you want to pass something, it has to be this. The Commerce Committee didn't like it, the House didn't like it, they fought off that attempt. HB 1633 passed Commerce, passed the first House vote, went into Finance, and there was a second attempt at a hijack in Finance. That was fought off yet again. The bill passed Finance, passed a second House vote, and went to Senate Judiciary. And just, I believe, last week or so, they successfully wiped 1633 clean, replaced it with this state takeover model, and that's where we find ourselves today.
Yeah, and one thing I find a little bit annoying about the current bill is that it puts the Liquor Commission in control of a lot of it, but they're actually not getting the revenue. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't even have the benefit the liquor store has, where we get some revenue from it. This is what's so wild to me. So the Republicans are apparently in favor, or were at one point, small government. I think that's something that I thought Republicans were in favor of. But you look at this bill and it's so crazy because they want the Liquor Commission to oversee the look, the feel, the decorations, the marketing of cannabis. Now, what does the Liquor Commission know about any of this stuff? I would gather not very much. And I'll tell you a funny fact. So I own a restaurant. We've talked about this, and a couple of years ago, when CBD was becoming a big thing, the Liquor Commission sent out this email to everyone that said, "Hey, just so you know, it's not legal to add CBD to beer or anything like that. It's not illegal. And just so that you know, CBD in cannabis is bad for your liver." I'm not even joking. The Liquor Commission told us that CBD in cannabis is bad for your liver. That is when I knew that this had absolutely nothing to do with logic or reason, you know, which are two things I really am desperate to bring back to the way government functions is simply logic and reason. The reality is, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but the Liquor Commission wants control over the cannabis because they are seeing people drink less alcohol, and they're seeing alcohol sales decline while cannabis sales in the states surrounding us go up. Would that be accurate?
It would be, and I think we got to back up for a moment because, you know, one of the things the sponsors with HB 1633 did was actually, once there was no franchise bill, they said, okay, we're going to address the governor's concerns. So they took that bill and stretched it as far as they could towards that model without crossing that line where the state has its fingers in the plant touching activity. And so that's where the agency model came from, because we have a few liquor stores where, you know, the government just doesn't think it's a big enough market, so they kind of license somebody out to sell liquor.
I did not know that. Okay, how many of those agencies are there?
Only like 2 or 3.
Okay,
I mean,
so they like the North Country, like just way up there, and they basically like, we don't want to. That's interesting. So that was the model that they were trying to use instead of the franchise.
Exactly, because here's the big thing, and I'll get to your point about the Liquor Commission in a minute, but this has been looked at by very intelligent people all over the country, and the main problem that we're trying to solve is how do we reduce the threat of federal intervention? And the basic solution to that was to say we have to keep the government's hands out of the plant touching activities. That's why most states have an independent commission that usually reports sideways, if anywhere else, no direct line to the state, and all the plant touching activities happen underneath that. So that's why what you would call more of a free market typical licensing model. And these structures matter. So a state-run model, right, was proposed a couple of years ago where the state is the business in the plant touching activities directly. Then comes this franchise model, which, you know, appears to draw one arm's length distance from the plant touching activities to the government. But the problem is the Liquor Commission reports directly to the government. So by default, you still have them with their hands in the plant touching activities, and it gets worse, because this actually lowers the bar to federal intervention from some nebulous federal agency saying, hey, New Hampshire, we don't want you having your hands in those activities, to one franchisee complaining to the FTC that they don't feel the state of New Hampshire is treating them fairly. And if the FTC finds that has merit, they could launch an investigation into the state of New Hampshire. And I'm not too sure our legislators want the federal government, you know, combing through their emails and their text messages and their meeting notes and phone calls. But the Liquor Commission has come out in one of the meetings and said during dry January they did notice that there was a reduction in alcohol consumption. So if you back up and you look at what's in this amendment, you start to realize that they're trying to hand this to the Liquor Commission to compensate for what they see in the future as a reduction in liquor sales. They're going to have just 15 stores with the ability for the Liquor Commission to have their hands in the plant touching activities up and down the supply chain, including pricing at the retail stores, which the vision will be these huge metal and concrete Walmart-style warehouses that will be the McDonald's of cannabis. That's how they tried to sell it in the House. Think of it like McDonald's. And I don't think anybody wants that, but if you wanted to set up a system with high barriers to entry that are going to favor the wealthy and connected, that are going to be insulated by the Liquor Commission, that's how you do it. So yes, you get legal cannabis in the state of New Hampshire without any of the economic opportunity, which is the point of cannabis legalization, to atone for the fact that the governments have been weaponizing cannabis possession and use against its citizens for decades. So yes, you're right. It's part and parcel of the problem. And I have to be honest with you, now that I've seen this, depending on what happens this year, I, for one, would not recommend the Liquor Commission go anywhere near the cannabis industry. We do need an independent commission, because once they overstep that boundary of being a regulatory body and become the business, that's where you run into all of these problems.
Yeah, and I think it's important for people to understand that the issue comes in when they use the word franchise, because franchises by definition are overseen by the federal government. And that's why the idea of going from just using the word agency as opposed to franchise suddenly takes it away from federal oversight. So I think that's a really important thing to understand, that there's a lot of moving parts here, and there's a lot of things that we just really don't know how the federal government will react. That you can assume that because they've let legal cannabis happen in different states, that they're not going to intervene. However, I can tell you that when Trump was president, Jeff Sessions really wanted to crack down on legal cannabis, and Trump said no because of the revenue, frankly, that these states were getting. He knew there'd be pushback. But who's to say that a future president might not say, hey, I'm not in favor of cannabis, and I'm not in favor of this system, and let's crack down on these states that are doing it in a way that we can, that we can crack down on. So you talked about 1633. Can you describe in a little bit more detail, how that bill would have worked, and presumably with a different administration, you're going to present a bill similar, if not maybe even the same one, I would guess.
So that's a good question. I'm not terribly sure that, it really kind of depends on who's in office. We favor a free market solution. The agency model was meant to put the state in direct regulatory control via the Liquor Commission to satisfy that concern of the governors. It's not optimal. It was, a negotiation. It was a compromise, if you will. But what the authors did was something brilliant, and they actually broke out a section in the bill to silo any of the areas where you start to get into the state getting their hands into operational control, because if it's just untenable or couldn't be done, that could be eliminated. You go back to the agency model and you're off and running, or a standard licensing model. So, these things were very important. So, we prefer a much more free market model. The sponsors tried to do everything that they could to satisfy the governor's concerns, and we believe that they did. And we believe there's no reason, aside for wanting to hand this to the Liquor Commission and wanting this to be a state-run, their hands in everything type of model, to do it. There's just none. So, I think if this doesn't work this year, and now we're in that precarious position we talked about, where both the sponsors and the association now have to fight to either have them revert this back to 1633, come way back closer to that original bill, or the Senate might as well just kill it themselves, because we're not convinced that the House would pass what is in that bill. 15% tax on medical patients. That's just insanity.
Is there a tax on medical right now at all?
No.
No tax.
No.
Okay.
So they go from no tax to 15% tax, which is just, why would you want to do that? And as you start peeling the layers of what's in this amendment back, you mentioned that they're going to control the look, the feel, the layout of all of the operations. They have the ability to override municipal control on where they are and how they operate. I thought we were a local control state. So you start looking at these things, and I am not at all convinced that the House is going to pass this. Our sponsors are not convinced that the House would pass this if it comes back. And so now we're at that precarious position where we're fighting against our own bill because it's not that bill anymore.
Yeah, that must be really hard to, fight to get a bill. And there was a time when I would have said, any bill is good. Like, let's just get it over let's just get it done. But then you look at the details of this bill and it's like, oh wait, there is a really terrible way to do it, and this is pretty much the worst way. I mean, the two things that really annoyed me a lot about it was, one, no provision for growing your own cannabis at home. I mean, come on, give us 4 or 5 plants at at least, because the thing that I know for a fact is that some people will try and grow cannabis, and a very small percentage will be successful at it because it's not easy, and it's why professionals do it. But the fact that we can't do it at all is just ridiculous. And that somebody with, even somebody with, with a medical issue that maybe was low income couldn't just grow it in their backyard for their own purposes. The other thing that really drove me nuts was the fact that the medical dispensaries that we have already were not just sort of granted a license to sell recreational, which seems totally unfair. And can you talk a little bit about the fact that the current medical dispensaries operate as nonprofits? Because I did not know this until I started digging in, and I think that's really important for people to realize that we've kind of handicapped this group, allowed this group to not work in its in an optimal way. This group of medical providers who are really providing a drug to people who are in pain or in cancer. The ways and the somewhat limited reasons you can get a medical permit in New Hampshire means that you're frankly in probably a lot of pain. You need this. So the idea that those providers are not being allowed to enter the market. Yeah, can you just talk a little bit about the current medical licenses, how they work, and then how that would work under the current proposed law?
So you're absolutely correct. They are nonprofits. There are, I believe, 3 companies, around 5 or 6 dispensaries in the state. We're very concerned about them. You know, if it was up to us, we think if they can pass the litmus test that each one should at least be guaranteed one retail license if they're going to cap it at 15. We had huge pushback on that. So then there was a kind of an argument to say, at least give us language that shows legislative intent, that we have a path, because we're afraid once adult rec is legalized, you are going to see a shift of some customers going over. It happens in every state. But that's important industry, important medicine for medical patients. So in HB 1633, there was language that said if you successfully ran an ETC in the state of New Hampshire, that was one of the criteria for getting a license. All right, that's legislative intent. That's been completely wiped out to say if you ran a dispensary in any state, that's going to be a leg up for you in the licensing process. So there are huge concerns there, and there are some legislators I've heard who say, well, we just think they're trying to monopolize the industry. They're not. They're begging for one little pathway to make sure that they can stay solvent and transition. Now, I think the best route to do that is actually dual-use licenses. There was an issue around maybe having two masters. People didn't like that, so now there would be a path for them to at least transition over. But there is nothing giving them much of any assurance in the amendment that was just passed. And I want to go back to the Liquor Commission for a moment, because you pointed out something very important. You know, 90 years ago, this was made as a limiting agency to restrict the consumption of hard liquor. Fast forward 90 years, we have family-friendly liquor stores. And as a proponent of cannabis legalization, I don't ever want to see that for the cannabis retail stores. And you know, to your point, I think the state has become very addicted to that money. And if we allow this to happen in the state of New Hampshire, we will never claw it back.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I mean, I just want to point out one sort of anecdotal criticism I have of the Liquor Commission and why the bureaucracy there has gotten way out of control. So a lot of people don't know this, but in the state of New Hampshire, it is illegal to open a bar or serve alcohol if you do not have 20 seats. And I know this because when I was getting my liquor license, this was so funny. The guy comes down to inspect from the Liquor Commission, and he's looking around. He said, all right, you got 20 seats. And I said, well, see the occupancy right there? It says 20 people. He said, no, you need 20 physical chairs in here. And I said, okay. So I literally, I live above my residence, so I literally had to go grab, because we had 18 seats. I had to go grab 2 chairs, 2 stools, stick them in the corner, and he goes, all right, you're all set. Click, you know. And I mean, there's a bunch of rules like this, these old blue laws that really they have been enforcing for probably, 90 years. No one knows why. I mean, another funny one is that you have to have your liquor that's stored locked up. It's got to be in a locked closet, right? That makes sense, I guess. But the thing is, in the bar, there's about 24 open liquor bottles that do not have to be locked up. And of course, they don't make me put those in the locked cabinet at night or anything. So if someone wanted to steal alcohol, it's there to be stolen. And when you ask the Liquor Commission about this, they just say, well, them's the rules, and we just enforce the rules. So I think that we need to look at all of our state agencies and say, what rules are you enforcing, and how much money is that costing the state of New Hampshire to enforce these rules that were written so long ago? No one even remembers why they were written. And how is it maybe potentially limiting the growth of the economy in New Hampshire when, for instance, you can't open a 10-seat little, cool bar? I mean, that just makes absolutely no sense to me. And expanding that into having the cannabis industry be overseen by the same sort of ancient bureaucracy that is not working does not make a lot of sense. And I think one interesting thing that people have brought up is it's possible that we might implement this law, right, the way that they're doing it, and then the feds go, hey, that's illegal. So they would have successfully passed cannabis legalization in a way that is actually impossible to implement, which is frankly the New Hampshire way. I mean, that just sounds something exactly like what we would do.
Yeah, you're right about that. And I mean, this is kind of getting in the weeds, but there are preemption laws that are in place. That means that there could be lawsuits where this never gets off the ground. There's just, every little part of it is so heinous. And another thing I'd like to point out is in HB 1633, there was a cannabis advisory board. And that advisory board was really to be a conduit from the operators to the government, along with a support mechanism to make sure that operators could get launched, get off the ground, and be successful within the rules and the laws that the commission, whatever it might be, are enforcing. That was changed completely into the who's who of law enforcement and legislators, and one of the senators came out recently and said the head of the Liquor Commission should be the chair of that board. Well, all of these people can already talk to the Liquor Commission, so what are we really doing here? It just shows you one more example of how that this is an advisory board meant to support the government takeover instead of being there for the residents of the state to be sure they have access to education and capital and all the resources they're going to need. So I advise people to really go look at this. You can go to NHCANN.org with 2 N's. We just wrote an article called "Are You Ready for the McDonald's of Cannabis?" And there's many other articles there where you'll start to really see how insidious this is once you peel through the details.
And that's New Hampshire CANN, NHCANN.org, right?
Correct, yep.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks, Daryl. I appreciate you coming on. Again, my name is Jon Kiper. You can learn more about me at votekiper.org. And we will see you in a couple weeks.